Hello, everyone. I'm so happy that you're here with us tonight. My name is Arlen Benavides, and I am your moderator, and I am the program director at the Environmental Forum of Marin. And like I said, I'm genuinely glad to have you here, and I'm so excited to be sharing the experiences and insights of our guest speakers today, especially because this is the first session of EFM's Forum 2022 on EFM's 50th anniversary year. For those who are new to the Environmental Forum of Marin, our mission at EFM is to promote sustainable world through environmental education. EFM has been reshaping the environment in Marin since our founding in 1972. And since then, its focus has been to provide Bay Area residents education for action. EFM has also taught about complex environmental issues and provides training for all who are eager to become effective advocates. That said, welcome again to the first session in our program series titled Housing Equity and Transformative Justice. At this time, I'd like to extend a special thank you to the Marin Environmental Housing Collaborative for sponsoring this event. Thank you for the climate resilience and social equity work that you lead. During tonight's webinar, we will be exploring new approaches to the challenges of providing safe, affordable, and environmentally sustainable housing to residents of our urban and rural communities. We hope you intentionally take in the insight our speakers will share with you, so you may serve as an empowered generator of equitable housing that you envision for your community or for the communities that you serve. And we hope that after the practices and tools that will be shared here today, you will be able to show up differently and more powerfully in activities around housing elements or the development of environmental goals and policies, or through other creative methods of your own innovative thinking. Tonight, we will hear from thoughtful and prolific speakers. First, we'll hear from Margareta Wong-Ling Lin, a UC Berkeley professor and executive director at Just Cities Institute, a policy justice organization. Margareta has served as a longtime leader in movements for racial justice, healing, and human rights. She applies research and public policy development to repair past policy and planning injustices through transformative community planning and policy design. As a government official, human rights lawyer, and activist, Margareta's work has resulted in the passage for fair chance housing, foreclosure prevention and mitigation, anti-displacement, environmental justice, and more. Second, we will hear from Pam Dorr. Pam is deeply committed to amplifying the practice of building equitable housing models. She has led a successful career overseeing affordable housing organizations in hard-to-serve areas. For instance, Pam previously led a HUD housing development organization to create home ownership opportunities in an underserved area within Alabama. She also served as a founding director of an organization called SOUP in Menlo Park, California, and currently she serves as the executive director of the Community Land Trust of West Marin. Suffice to say, we are accompanied by leaders, change makers, and compassionate activists who are creating housing access by way of love-based advocacy, law, and housing policies. During the webinar, we encourage your participation, so please turn on your cameras, but most importantly, write questions that you have for our speakers in the Q&A. Bill Carney, president of Sustainable San Rafael and secretary of Marin Can, a new forming nonprofit in Marin County, will moderate the Q&A session after the presentations. Now, without further ado, I invite our first speaker, Margareta.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much, Arlen and Leah, for inviting me into this conversation, and happy 50th birthday, EFM. That's quite an accomplishment. So would you like to start my slides? There we go. Thank you very much. So when Arlen first talked with me about being part of tonight's conversation, his original ask was, can I explain about California's housing elements and the general plan requirements and the state's new affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements for all jurisdictions in California. And these are my passion projects. We're doing this work right now in several cities in the Bay Area and statewide. And I had to step back a bit and say, you know, what really moves me for a new audience is, instead of my showing up with my policy wonk hat, with my teacher hat, because I also teach at the UC Berkeley, the Goldman School of Public Policy, and the City Planning School. I wanted to really step back and talk to one another as fellow human beings. And I think oftentimes when we're thinking about complex societal issues like housing and homelessness, we think about the numbers. We think about specific public policies and barriers and analysis and data. But I wonder if we think about the people enough. And so I wanted to focus my conversation with you all tonight on stepping back and thinking about what are the stories that are told to us and that we tell one another about today's homelessness and housing insecurity. And what can the role of this model called transformative community planning, transformative public policy design look like in trying to address these systemic injustices? And since EFM is an environmental organization and taking a page from the environmental movement and the great carbon footprint, is there a way for us to begin imagining, along the lines of John Lennon, of applying a humanity footprint to addressing Marin County, Alameda County, California, our nation's, the world's housing and other human rights imperatives? Next. So to help me get started in this conversation, we have Thomas and Angela. So Thomas is going to help us get started with the first question. What have been the stories told to us about who are the people unhoused or housing insecure? Good evening, Thomas.
Hello, and good evening to you and to everybody else. And to go ahead and answer this first question, I kind of just initially thought what was more traditional and like a common view, like that, or a common view on unhoused people. Like in my experience, it has been told to me that people who are unhoused or are housing insecure are, one, addicted to a hard drug or some other substance. Two, they may be people who have a severe mental health problem. And or three, they may just be people who do not want to work, and yeah, I understand that they are unfortunate views because they are not all necessarily true. And yeah.
Thank you, Thomas. And those are very powerful and mainstream narratives about people who are unhoused. And I'm wondering, can I ask you a follow-up question?
Of course, yeah.
So you're definitely right that that is the mainstream narrative. And I'm wondering if that aligns with your understanding and your lived experiences of knowing people who are housing insecure or unhoused.
It does not. I mean, it definitely is a part of it. But when I first thought about basically just like my personal interactions with other people, it's just a very simplistic view people may initially have. But when you look further and you actually start talking to people who may be unhoused, then you really understand that there's a whole different range of issues that that people kind of experience and just puts them in a very hard time. And yeah, there's also other factors as well.
That's right. And when we think about issues of addiction, as a lawyer, I know that people in my profession, the legal profession, have incredibly high rates of addiction. When we think of mental illness and mental health needs, that cuts across the board, right? When we think of issues of underemployment or unemployment, I know a lot of trust fund babies who aren't working. So what's the difference between those folks who we know who have those issues and folks who are living in encampments under our freeways?
I think yeah, it goes towards like opportunity of what's available, because it's not just like what the individual can do, but it's also what's kind of like provided. Yeah, the opportunities that are provided by our systems.
Great, thank you.
That's the difference.
Thank you, Thomas. And to help us continue that line of inquiry, I believe Angela will be joining us.
Hi.
Hi, Angela.
Hi, can you see me?
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
So thank you for being part of this conversation and engaging with the second question of what have we been led to believe are the reasons why people are unhoused or housing insecure? And Thomas started that inquiry with us and wondered if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, I have something written down, like a short paragraph, and it is quite similar to what Thomas was saying. Throughout my life, I've heard a lot of sentiment about the reason why people are unhoused being due to like personal responsibility on their part, like they're lazy, irresponsible, and should just get a job, and also they're criminals or drug addicts. So yeah, things implying that they either deserve or choose to be unhoused, and it was used as a reason to ignore them and treat them as disposable. I was watching a TikTok about or run by an unsheltered teenager who shares videos on how he cooks food for cheap using like portable electric cookware. And some of the comments on those videos were saying that because he's unhoused, he shouldn't have a cell phone and other gadgets and stuff like that. And yeah, it's just really horrifying to think about like that sentiment, considering that like being unsheltered is often criminalized in this country. So yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for that insight, Angela. And what you said really resonates with me because when I first came to this country when I was 4 years old, shortly after the Chinese Exclusion Act was lifted in practice, the Vietnam War was raging, and the mainstream narrative about the Vietnamese people, which then like extended to all Asians, right, was that they're not like us, you know, meaning it's okay to bomb them and commit atrocities against them because they don't bleed and feel the way we do, right? So in order to treat people in very inhumane ways, we have to first, in our heads and our minds, to humanize them and other them. So thank you for being part of this conversation. Next. And so just building on what Angela was sharing with us and thinking about how we got here, right? Wanted to share this great quote from the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, their publication called Roots, Race, Place, A History of Racially Exclusionary Housing in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it says, the rampant displacement seen today in the San Francisco Bay Area is built upon a history of exclusion and dispossession centered on race and driven by the logic of capitalism. This history established massive inequities in who owned land, who had access to financing, and who held political power, all of which determined and still remain at the root of deciding who can call the Bay Area home. Who gets to call the Bay Area home? The struggle of being able to live and to belong is rooted in this long history and legacy of racism and about land possession or land dispossession. Next. So just stepping back a bit and zooming out and looking at the issues from a national perspective, I think it's always important to understand that the current conditions have not always been this way. And if we don't ground ourselves in that understanding, then it's hard to believe that it's possible to solve for big issues, right? So just with recent history, from 2007 to 2016, the United States was actually driving down homelessness rates. There was a decline of 15% in homelessness across the nation. Including in the city of Oakland, where I had worked during that time period as the deputy city administrator. However, beginning 2016, we started to see a dramatic rise in homelessness nationally as well as in our cities, with a over 5% increase in just 4 years, right? And to the quote I read earlier from Othering and Belonging Institute, there are systematic, structural, political reasons for this. right? It is possible in our nation, it is possible in the state of California to make sure that everyone has a home, that everyone is prevented from being evicted or being dispossessed. And in Marin County, from 2019 to 2022, there's an increase of 8.4% in homelessness. And there are great resources and links to those resources in this slide. Next. It's also important how we answer these questions because it really defines how we invest our limited public resources. So analysis that I did with some of my Goldman students in looking at the city of Oakland's investments in homelessness funding, we found that the priority for the funding was not on the prevention of homelessness. It takes probably 1/10 the funds needed to prevent someone from losing their home versus addressing the downstream problem of homelessness. Similarly, in examining at that point, about $185 million that were going into so-called affordable housing in the city of Oakland, we found that only a fraction of that money was going into the type of housing that unhoused people need. There are structural, systematic, and political reasons for why we're here today facing the kind of problems that we're facing. Next slide. So in thinking about how the role of transformative justice can help us deal with our problems of housing insecurity and homelessness, I wanted to bring into the conversation my former mentor, boss, and great friend, former Congressman Ron Dellums, who passed away a few years ago. Ron was an amazing leader for transformative justice and for humans all over our globe. The reason that he was a champion for the Vietnam War, ending the Vietnam War, for women's rights, for LGBTQ rights, for climate change. He was actually the first person in Congress to introduce climate change legislation, for redress for Japanese American internment, was proximity. That growing up in the Bay Area, he was in relationship with all this diversity of humanity. And he opened his heart up to that diversity of humanity. So that when he was in this incredible position of serving us in Congress, he honored the stories and the lived experiences that people shared with him. Next. So there's this really wonderful, vibrant new movement in the world of urban planning and public policy design centered around these principles of transformative public policy making and transformative planning. So in the words of one of the early leaders of this movement, Professor Marie Kennedy from the University of Massachusetts, says, if we believe in participatory democracy, It is not enough to work in disadvantaged communities. It is important how we work in communities. In order to create positive social change in the face of pretty big challenges, we need to unleash the creative energies of ordinary people. So how do we go about unleashing the creative energies of ordinary people? First and foremost, and this is very challenging for people in government because we are conditioned to believe that we are the experts. The centering principle of transformative public policy making and planning is the inclusion of people who are being most impacted by the problem we're trying to solve, to be at the table in designing the policy solutions. Second, to understand the inherent limits of official data, of whose stories are included and whose stories are actually excluded from that data. And in that understanding, to be willing to be creative and utilize non-traditional data sources so that we can be fully informed and have the information and tools we need to hit our mark in solving the problem. And third, engaging in the principles of cultural humility and acknowledge the professional biases that exist in our professions. Next. So I wanted to share with you tonight a story of an example of work that I've had the enormous honor and privilege of doing in applying this model of transformative justice to solve a major housing problem. And it addresses the issues of what happens to people when they come home from prison and the barriers they face in trying to access the basic human needs and rights of housing. And this artwork is from Celeste, the amazing artist, Celeste Byers, who designed this original artwork for us on our Fair Chance Housing campaign. Next. And to help with telling this story, we have a little clip from the amazing film 13th. Highly recommend you watching it if you haven't already done so. Oh, I think there's a sound issue. I'm not hearing any sound.
So let's look at the statistics. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about that.
A little country with 5% of the world's population having 25% of the world's prisoners, 1 out of 4 human beings with their hands on bars, shackled in the world here in the land of the free.
We had a prison population 300,000 in 1972. Today we have a prison population of 2.3 million. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world.
So you see now, suddenly they're an awakening that, oh, perhaps we need to downsize our prison system. It's gotten too expensive. It's gotten out of hand. But the very folks who often express so much concern about the cost and the expanse of the system are often very unwilling to talk in any serious way about remedying the harm that has been done.
Thank you for showing that clip. So I was working on a research project with some of my students from the Goldman School. And we interviewed, well, first we developed relationships with, and then talked with about 100 people living in encampments in different parts of Oakland. This was a few years ago. And we learned that over 70% of the people we talked with have a criminal record. Over 70%. There are structural, systemic, political reasons for why things are the way they are. So it turns out when people return home from having survived mass incarceration, that they're actually not able to live with family members because rental agreements prohibit someone with a criminal record from living in that housing unit. They are unable to rent on their own, including publicly subsidized housing units and Section 8 federally subsidized housing units as well. So where are people supposed to live? This is why we have this number, 73% of people in Oakland's encampments with a criminal history. Next. So I had the great honor of working for several years with people who were formerly incarcerated and their family members to right this wrong. And we worked with allies in city government, starting with the city of Berkeley and then with the city of Oakland, to design the policy terms for what is now considered the nation's best fair chance housing laws, which basically says that one's past history has nothing at all to do with one's suitability today as a tenant. There is no evidence that someone with a criminal past, a conviction history, won't be a good neighbor, won't take good care of your property, won't pay their rent on time, right? And speaking at the press conference we held in City Hall is Mrs. Sherry, whose son, Simba Rache Sherry, had been killed. And he was killed the day she was advocating for his human rights when we were at a meeting in the city of Berkeley with a council member. And so in the next slide, we have a video clip so you can hear it directly from Ms. Sherry and other community leaders.
It's the reason why we call it the hood, because we lost the neighbor aspect. East Oakland I grew up in, we knew our neighbors. Crack and the violence completely obliterated that trust.
East Oakland, foreclosures hit East Oakland. 70% of unhoused folks are Black people who live really in East Oakland. I've seen the absolute systemic reduction of our ability to live.
But it's like all of a sudden Oakland became this place to be, and the rents began to double, triple, even quadruple.
I think everyone's fear is that it's going to lead to even more erasure of what has historically been Oakland.
Several years ago, my son Simarache made a mistake that cost him and me dearly. Discrimination was taking place on a lot of levels, so we felt it was a need to step up to the plate.
There's been a lot of victories, there's been a lot of wins. The entire city council agreed with us that this was an example of environmental racism. We have a right to have a good existence, to have homes, to have peace, to have place.
When you raise up the issues of African Americans, you raised up the issues of all people.
We have to always consider the human element of any policy we are working on.
I had a meeting with the Berkeley City Council around the Fair Chance Housing Ordinance.
What would it look like to acquire land, to have a space and a place where people can live, where they can exist?
The community comes together and builds relationships and builds power. Like, that was the ultimate goal.
Oakland is not just an edgy slogan to wear on a t-shirt. For those of us who grew up here, it really means something.
When we work together, we can do all kinds of things.
It's gonna take us to save us. It's gonna take us to save us.
So I am going to pause here because I want to make sure that you all get the chance to hear from Pam. So I'm sorry so much, Pam, for going a little over my time.
It's the reason why we call it.
I might jump in and start sharing if that's okay. Maybe I'm going to share. Here we go. Sorry to take a sec. So I think one of the things I really want to start with is just getting, I guess one of the things I really want to talk about is how we're going to fix it. You know, this thing, the idea comes up a lot of we're waiting around for someone to help us fix this housing crisis, or someone's going to come fix it for us. I really get the feeling that there aren't a lot of people coming to fix this crisis. And while there may be policies that change and political will that changes, I think a lot of this is going to fall to us to fix. And I want to just talk about what that might mean. And I usually start by talking about what affordable is. And it's kind of weird over in Marin County, where I'm working, that median income is $166,000 a year for a family of four. And I wanted to show all the different levels of income, only because it's so fascinating to see what real humans are making in this chart and where most of us might fall. As a nonprofit worker, I don't make anywhere near median income, and nor will I. And I wonder how housing for the rest of us is going to happen and what part we'll play in that. I also listed on the slide the name of each of these AMIs, area median income, what's acutely low, what's extremely low, very low, and low. And it's just kind of odd to think about low income being $149,000 a year. And even then, when you look at this chart, which shows for a family of four in Marin County, if you were fortunate to be low income and make $149,000 a year, you can afford a house that sells for $730,000 a year, or $730,000. But we know there hasn't been a house at that level in Marin County in a long time. And so it really makes you start to think about where people are living and how we're all going to help each other stay in the places where we work. And so typically a community land trust is really just made up of a third of the board seats are reserved for folks that live in community land trust homes or rent. A third are reserved for people in the community, and a third for people with maybe specialties that could help the land trust be sustainable. And typically the land trust does that by retaining the land under a home in the public realm for good, which means it's stewarded by the public through a land trust board. And then the improvements above the land is really what is bought or sold. That's the item that could be rented or sold. And not everybody wants to own a house, but if they do, it's nice to have options available. I was helping this past weekend. The Bolinas Community Land Trust is selling their first home, and it was donated to them, and they're selling it to the community. And it's a beautiful little 1-bedroom house with an ocean view for $389,000. And they do that by retaining the land under the house and selling the improvements above the house. And even then, it's going to be expensive for a lot of us. The biggest project that CLAM's working on right now, I work for the Community Land Trust in West Marin, so it's Pam at CLAM, which is horrible to say. The biggest project we're working on is some federal land where a decommissioned Coast Guard base had been sitting empty. The housing in it has been sitting empty, and the federal government gave that to the county, which allowed CLAM to bid for that, and we're redeveloping it with a partner, Eden Housing, and we're developing 51 homes. And it might not sound like a lot of homes, but in a small place like Point Reyes Station, that can be considerable. And I think it's really interesting to see how we're going to steward those units in perpetuity so they always remain affordable. And that's typically called permanent affordable housing. I wanted to show a slide from Alfred Twu, who really talks about, he's a UC Berkeley grad who I think is just brilliant graphically, and he helps bring a lot of the affordable housing laws to life for me graphically. And he shows kind of in this slide the things that are missing in our housing that might have been around at the turn of the century, 1920s through 1940s. You had a lot of smaller homes, even cottages. You had a range of housing. And then sometime in the 70s, we started developing only single family homes for 3-bedroom, 2-bath, larger homes. And then they kind of became monster homes where a lot of us don't want to live and could never afford to live. This shows kind of that range of missing housing that disappears. And you start to think about the new California laws that allow every single family lot in California to now support 4 homes. So any lot that used to house 1 house can now house 4 families. And you think about how that's going to work. What's it look like to kind of have a duplex on the front half of the lot and a duplex on the back half? And can you do a lot split? And what does that look like? How do you finance that? How do you create more ownership for folks right where they're working? And maybe sometimes doing that in unused space in the backyard seems almost remarkably exciting. And I think this was probably my most exciting assembly bill that I'd seen in a long time. It's AB 803, or the starter home reg. And you start to see what can happen instead of living next door to a big rental complex. You see what small starter homes look like, same density, housing the same number of people, but taking I guess what it is, it's really that money that would be in the pockets of somebody that's really wealthy and putting it in the hands of a family that could really use it. And choosing to have this next to your home, instead of having a big apartment complex, could we have starter homes? So when I see these kind of regs happening all through California, I get really excited. Starter homes is kind of the new thing that I think about. This is a sample of just a backyard home, a little 700 square foot, 2-bedroom, 1-bath. This one happens to be factory built housing that's really easy to reproduce. You kind of get to bypass your local planning jurisdiction because it comes already permitted from the state. And you set them on permanent foundations in a backyard, it starts to provide pretty low cost housing that a lot of us could afford. And you could think of this as a basic starter home. You can also start to think about self-help housing. A long time ago when people needed housing, they built it themselves. And you think about what you could do in your own neighborhoods. And this was a project, this was one of the first houses I helped frame up with some students. And it's really easy to start to think about, like, what do I have the skills to do? What can I watch YouTube and learn and not screw up too bad? Maybe sometimes together we could be a better source of opportunity to create permanence for each other so we're not displaced. For a long time, I ran a weird art studio where I casted people in plaster, and I really specialized in casting women with cancer and finding, you know, kind of where we hold that in our bodies, you know, how we talk about it in a form. And so housing wasn't so different from that. In the littlest house in this picture was a house that somebody allowed me to buy when I was in high school. And in a weird, freakish way, kind of gave me my own mortgage. I didn't have to go to a bank. I got to pay the family for the house, and I paid for it over time, and it was not attractive. It had a beautiful view, and inside it was a disaster. It was one of these places that had been built pre-railroad, and it had kind of fallen apart. And what I did was rebuilt it with stuff from the dump. And I think when I did that, it was the Colma dump. They had a trash pick section at the time where you could get free and found materials. And it was really interesting to see, you know, what I could do with my limited skill set and no money. And I think sometimes when we're waiting for someone to come fix things for us, just being able to try something ourselves starts to make the panic of it feel worse. And this was a house in my neighborhood that none of my neighbors liked. It was pretty ugly. And of course, I wanted to rebuild it. And when I did, on the inside, it was wrecked, right? No electrical, no plumbing. It was a bit of a mess. And with just free and found materials, everything in the house came for free off Craigslist or off Nextdoor. I got a stove from 1940. The cabinets were the same base cabinets I just refinished, open shelving, all the furniture, the chairs, the Hoosiers, everything was free that I found by somebody's trash section. We kind of took it home and fixed it up. And it eventually became a really pretty space inside. And my yard, I got my own jackhammer and took out the concrete yard that was put in the 1950s and started to grow food for my neighbors. And in the backyard was a little backyard home or accessory dwelling unit. So I was using my backyard for a home. And then the next thing, of course, I wanted to work on is what? Crappy garage. Nobody wants a place for your car when you could have a place for people. And somehow my 80-year-old uncle made me jackhammer the floor and then got in and inspected that my plumbing was right. And eventually I built my garage into a space where I could live and I could gift my home to a family that could use a bigger space. And I'm just showing you my weirdo projects, not because I want to bore you to death, but I think because it gives you a sense of what we could do with no skills. I'm not a person that can build. And I am a person that feels like I can watch YouTube until my eyes blur over and learn how to do things. And just wanted to show just a couple projects of stuff I've been working on. So I'm going to stop sharing that.
I'm going to present Bill. I previously mentioned that he is president of Sustainable Sarah Fell and also secretary of Marin, the nonprofit organization. Bill, would you like to moderate the Q&A for us? Any questions that you may have? There's also a few that have come through the Q&A chat box. If you would like to lead us through this conversation, please.
Okay. Well, good evening, Arlen. And Pam and Margarita. Happy to be here, and what a great subject and what a great range of perspectives that the two of you have offered. I am actually looking for chat questions, and my version of chat, I'm not seeing them. So Arlen, I don't know if I've got the right one or not, but I can launch in while I'm waiting for that with a couple of things that I wanted to follow up on. I think the question of housing size is really an interesting one, Pam, that you bring up. And I'd like to pursue that some in the different varieties that housing can come in. And going to Margarita's points, why aren't we getting that housing from the market, right? Why is housing as a commodity in our commodity-driven society not working? Why isn't it being produced? And I'm kind of curious in what we can do locally to address that issue.
I think, the idea of decommodifying housing makes a lot of sense, and getting it off the appreciating market for working families, families that are lower income that need it, is essential. I think the thing that we fail to talk about probably the most is the only tool to build affordable housing in the nation is low-income housing tax credits. That's really the only tool in California that works. And truthfully, unless you want a huge housing development next to you, that's not going to build starter homes. It's not going to build community land trust housing. It's a really unusual method. It was never intended to be the only way to fund affordable housing, and yet it is the only tool we have access to. And Margaret is right. We want new housing types. We want smaller homes. We want development in the hands of folks that are using those homes. And to do that, we need financing tools that make it possible. And we're missing those tools.
Pam, do you have additional insights into how to get the support you need from City Hall?
I was really amazed at the community around Point Reyes or the villages around Tomales Bay in trying to get the Coast Guard project. It was one of those things that almost felt impossible, how to get the feds to pass land. And it worked. And it worked because voices were heard and they were loud and they were repeated. And it maybe took, I think that project started in 2013, and it's still not, the land's not actually in the hands of the community yet, but it will be. And while it is a long process, I was impressed with how once it started, it really took a strong path forward fast. It was wonderful.
Okay. Both of you have mentioned land trust and that model, and I'd be curious. I mean, you're working in very different places. So I'd be curious about how that experience has been. And this is echoing a question from Bob. Please discuss how the land trust model can apply generally, but also specifically to multifamily housing. And maybe Pam, you could lead off with that one.
Sure. The way we're using it at the Coast Guard site is that will be considered multifamily. There's townhomes and apartments. We might even have a section there that we're hoping to use for ownership housing, so outside of the tax credit projects. But typically we want to ground lease the land under the multifamily project, keep that in the hands of the community, and the improvements above would be done in the tax credit model. But I think what we're seeing on the other side, not the denser multifamilies, but on the other side is trying to keep people in the community. And a land trust is a very good partner to do that. So an example we call age in place, where the land trust might do a life estate to keep someone in the community. And when they pass, then that land passes into the community land trust. Another way we're doing it is through just generous people in the community. If they don't have an heir and want to create a legacy for themselves in the community, they can allow us to buy that home at a discounted price. Their family still gets to inherit, that from the sale, they'll get that money. And then we create an ownership or a rental unit. Then we develop the backyard into another unit and potentially sell two homes separately at a discounted price. So those are just ways that a land trust is working in the community. And there's lots of land trusts around right now. We're a growing breed.
Yeah, and it strikes me that sometimes the public government itself serves in a similar function, that they get a hold of land for affordable housing or for whatever, and they hold on to it. So they keep the fee simple land ownership themselves, but then can have greater flexibility in getting others to build the kind of housing that's wanted. for the good of the public. So there's a lot to be learned, I think, both ways there. Yeah, and I want to follow up at some point on inclusionary housing also and how that interfaces with the marketplace. But a question from Elizabeth, who's inspired, Pam, by your do-it-yourself efforts, and notes that Jimmy and Rosalind Carter introduced us to Habitat for Humanity, which is based on that sweat equity model. What's been your experience with that?
Thanks for asking about Habitat. I'm a big Habitat fan for a couple of reasons. I love a 0% interest loan more than anyone. And I love the idea that they're creating ownership with the idea that that house remains with the family that buys it. And it's not really flipped. And I started and ran a Habitat chapter for a long time that I really enjoyed. Bolinas is currently partnering, Bolinas Community Land Trust is partnering with Habitat for Humanity Greater San Francisco to create some manufactured homes in Bolinas on some donated land. And it's really interesting to see those partnerships. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for community land trusts and other nonprofits to work together. Maybe the National Park Service working with a nonprofit, Habitat working with nonprofits. It's just really interesting to see together creatively what we can do when there's a huge need. I think I noticed Johnson Reynolds, you mentioned about those manufactured homes in Bolinas, and those will be coming on the market, I believe next month. So they're coming relatively soon. And also that could create, you think about these starter homes or AB 803, Assembly Bill 803, that could be the new co-housing model we see, where you're seeing a slightly, in a lot of our communities through the housing element, you're really starting to see some upzone properties where you might have a little bit more density, and we might be able to create some housing that we might want to live in. It's exciting to start to think about.
Okay. Couple of cluster of questions here that are kind of specific to Marin in a way, not maybe specific, but characteristic. So what are these are from two Susans. What are the tensions between creating housing and sustaining biodiversity and open space? And also, how can we create, from another Susan, how can we create balance between the need for open spaces for people and wildlife and the overwhelming need for homes? And there's a third from an anonymous questioner about what about water?
Yeah.
And that resource, is it a limitation on housing?
Yeah, I think that's probably a really important thing to think about. Do we need housing everywhere, or could we cluster it in the places where we might have infrastructure that can support it? When you're thinking about the villages around Tomales Bay and really thinking about how most of unincorporated Marin doesn't have even sewer, we're all on septic and we're leaching into really ecologically sensitive habitats. It makes you really wonder if there's a better way to do this kind of work. And, I think about even myself in my own house as a senior, as I'm starting to think about aging, water will be my biggest expense. I'm able to have solar. Even if it's solar, I learned to install myself over YouTube. Eventually, I've got to figure out how I'm going to deal with my water. And that's going to be my biggest expense going forward. And I think about people that control power in the future are going to control water.
For that perspective. And, I also think in terms of Marin, that, looking outward towards whatever ranch lands, open space, has a lot of downsides to it. But to quote from a movie, don't look up. If you look up, there's a lot of space around our traditional town centers that we could build up or build more densely in the sort of small textured, small sized housing that Pam was talking about. So there are opportunities, I think, to really look at the whole land resource, which is, I think, what you were referencing. And what are the best uses for it that serve the people who work here, the people who live here, and the diversity of the community. I mean, one of the things that is, I think, not remarked enough about is that Marin is losing its workforce, it's losing its economic diversity, and we're all much poorer for that in terms of our daily experience and just the sense of the community that we belong to as we get more and more homogenous. So let's see, a couple of questions here from Johnson. What about manufactured housing? Is that an option to be considered, particularly when you talk about different sizes of units? And also, what about co-housing? That idea of sharing, you mentioned it in construction, Pam, but what about in actual, sharing space in the development and the occupancy of housing?
I think factory built housing, thinking about like panelized housing, modular, manufactured, just the idea that we could start to reproduce more quickly. We still have to find a way to bypass the local permitting jurisdictions that are slowing it down. Like when I'm thinking about reproducing housing and I'm stuck, so many people don't want to get permits because it's going to be 20 to 30% of your cost is going to be in permitting. And thinking about a modular home, if I want to set a 700 square foot factory built modular home that comes pre-permitted from the state HCD and I want to set it in my backyard, I'm still going to take a year and a half to get it there, permitting wise. Or I could just order it, pay for it, and have it come in. There's this kind of struggle between that, even with the new laws that say you're going to be given a permit within 30 days or 60 days, the total time it takes is going to be a year and a half and it's going to cost me $30,000 to get it there. And that's with all the simplifications that we've done. It's still not working yet. Even with the new laws that say I can have a backyard home, no one can tell me that I can't, and no one can tell me I have to have a garage that houses a car. I can now have it for a unit. But the truth is, by the time I request that information, pay for a structural engineer, pay for my drilling for my foundation, the designer, engineer costs, it's crazy what the costs turn out to be. It's so off-putting. I can't see how anybody could actually commit to doing it, let alone thinking about our aging population, how they're going to commit to taking on that kind of debt to create more housing. It's just unrealistic to believe that it's a way forward. Sorry. I love factory built housing, but we're just not there yet with the cycle of making it actually work.
Yeah, we get our city council members who agree with that. So that's 5 at a time usually, or a majority of them. What would you ask them to do to bring about that kind of transition from market to community-based housing?
Well, I wanted just to share something that happened recently over in Point Reyes. We had an opening in an affordable rental, and a family that works in the community took that rental. And because of that, they were living in Pinole, driving into Point Reyes Station. And just by taking that rental, they were able to save 21,000 miles a year on the roads coming to and from work. And I was just thinking about what that cost is to our environment. And we think of it being so expensive to create a housing unit, but you think of that cost year after year after year being borne by the environment, and what a gift it is to be able to live where you work, just in terms of living. It feels like we can't make a choice not to do housing where we're working.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's see. We have time for maybe one additional question. I think I'm going to return to the inclusionary housing question I alluded to before. And here in San Rafael, we've been, back and forth on this for the last few years. And the result has been, well, we reduced our requirement of, from 20% to 10% on the notion that, well, that would bring in more housing developers. And of course, that would be largely for market rate units. And they could provide some of that 10% in the way of in lieu fees that could then be leveraged through nonprofit developers to produce greater numbers of housing. So a lot of detail there, but what do you think about inclusionary housing as a way of local governments essentially requiring a greater income diversity within our housing stock?
Maybe I'll jump in first and then maybe I'll pass it off to you if that's okay. I guess I was thinking reducing inclusionary requirements seem ridiculous, number one. The idea that a market rate developer is going to walk away for a 10% change just makes no sense. And this idea that we're somehow going to translate in lieu fees into built units, it's just crazy because the costs are escalating so fast that we just can't keep it up. And I just love the idea of all that. And think about this, all those units that are being developed through inclusionary, if that was to pass to the land trust and be in the hands of the community, it was community controlled, whether it was rental or ownership, you've got housing that's affordable in perpetuity, and you have a steward for that community land trust board is who's managing that property. I can't think of a better opportunity than inclusionary, and the more the better. That's my feeling.
Okay. I see Arlen is back with his clock, but I want to let me conclude with what is more a comment than a question from Johnson again. And I think this summarizes a lot of good thinking. Housing together, tiny mobile rental home, townhomes, single family homes for an income diverse community, sharing with one another across income, race, cultural differences. And I would add from another audience member, also tribal communities being part of that mix as well, since this is their land. Arlen.
Thanks so much, Bill. I was tuning in so adamantly into this conversation, I forgot that I was moderating. But again, I want to thank our presenters today, our speakers, for sharing your time and your resources and experiences with us. It has been such a pleasure to work with you and to hear your experiences, and apologies for all the technical glitches that happened along the way, but I think it was a really fruitful conversation. So thank you. And thank you again for all our participants who tuned in today to be with us. We really appreciate you. And thank you for our event sponsor, Marin Environmental Housing Collaborative. Now at this time, I would like to also add a plug for the next session that we're going to have, which will either focus on rewilding and biodiversity, or indigeneity, values and practices tied to place. So look out for more details on our website, or sign up for our newsletter to receive event emails delivered directly to you, to your inbox. And we're going to take some of your questions that you posted in the Q&A, and we're going to try to do follow-up research to be able to provide some of the information that perhaps was not communicated fully. There's more information, there's more content that is valuable to understand from some of these questions that were posed. So we're going to be able to try to serve you in that capacity. For upcoming sessions, the upcoming session is really for people who are curious about sustainable management practices, ecological restoration at the intersection of the changing planet. So more information to come. We will share this recording with all who attended and all who registered, and we're also going to be able to send you action items that the presenters recommended for you to take a look at. So thank you again for being here. Thank you for the presenters, and we look forward to seeing you and being with you again in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
See you guys. Bye, Bill. Bye, Arlen.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for facilitating the Q&A.
Nice
Yeah,
to meet you.
absolutely. Thanks for inviting me.